I typically see some of you folks, especially on X, asking what is the point of South Africa becoming part of the Brics countries if we are not trading as much with some of these countries? Because if you look at our activity, with the exception of what we export to China, a number of the Brics countries, we're not doing that much trade with them. And that's particularly true for the agricultural sector. And I think the question of why are we there and the frustration that some people typically express is perhaps an important thing that we must engage and engage it seriously, especially in an environment like today, where whenever you look on the newspaper, you realize that most countries are busy establishing trade relations with a number of countries across the world because the environment that we are in is changing. We are no longer in the world that was predictable, and all the long-term trading partners that we had, we were pretty much doing business in a normal way. And now there are new alliances that are being formed. And I think that there is a yearning to say, within the Brics countries, can we solidify and come up with something that is just beyond the high-level political talks? Because let's face it, although South Africa has hosted the BRICS Summit in 2023, and all of the other major members of the BRICS countries, especially the original members, have hosted the summit, it has pretty much been centered on a more political, geopolitical, and high-level discussions. There's not a lot of work that we have actually seen that aid the matters of trade within this grouping. And in fact, I'll say this, as someone who has been involved in here, especially on the BRICS Business Council, on the South Africa side, and in 2023, we had an opportunity to chair the global aspect as South Africa was the chair of BRICS. One of the points that we raised in agriculture was that we need to ensure that we deepen trade, elevate this topic, and perhaps maybe submit it to the political leaders. And that's exactly what we did. But that viewpoint was not shared equally by all of the members of the BRICS countries. There were those that preferred that we discuss more issues related to inputs, others matters of climate change. And at the end, we did not come up with anything that is concrete, that is related to trade, that the political leaders can perhaps maybe also take forward. But what is interesting in all of this, if you look at the BRICS members and what they've been doing over the past few months, a number of them have been signing a lot of trade agreements with countries outside the BRICS countries. Take India, for example. They've already signed about 3 trade agreements between mid-2025 and today. They've signed a trade agreement with the UK. They are doing something with Oman, and they signed a trade agreement with New Zealand. And right now, we know that they are about to talk to Canada. And at any time, they can be signing a trade agreement with the EU. So they are moving ahead and making sure that they are opening up as many avenues as they can for their businesses, agriculture, industry, manufacturers, so that they are able to export more to other new avenues and forming all of these new alliances. And I think India is doing that in recognition of today's realities, that we are in an unpredictable world, and many of the partners that they've relied on are starting to look elsewhere. But also the fact that India itself is seeing an increase in the output of a number of industries there, and they want to grow their economy. And one way of doing that is ensuring that you pursue the export approach. China is doing the same. We know that they are talking to Canada, and there's a number of countries that consistently approach China and making sure that they get some free trade agreements with China. Brazil is also in the same way, because although there's been a lot of discussion between Mercosur, which Brazil is part of, along with Argentina, Uruguay, and the others, they've finally been able to sign a trade agreement with the EU. That now offers the Brazilian farmers, and indeed the entire South American farmers, access to the EU market. And the EU is one of the important markets for the South African agricultural sector. Because remember, although we export around $14 billion of agricultural exports, if you look at where they go, the EU remains an important market for us. About 20% of the South African agricultural exports go to the EU. Now you are having the South Americans potentially also exporting there, tariff-free, and Brazil is one of the major producers and exporters of citrus, as well as some grains and various agricultural products. And those products that they will be exporting tariff-free to the EU will be competing with South Africa. So we are seeing all of this happening where a number of the BRICS countries don't seem to be as averse on the trade matters, because it would be understandable if they were not keen on coming together and signing up a BRICS free trade agreement. But it does mean or seem that they are actually keen on trade matters, because if that was the case, they wouldn't be busy and signing all of these trade agreements with the other countries. So they are doing that. But if we look at what they are doing within the grouping of BRICS, there is not a lot of consolidation that happens there. And this is worrying in today's environment where diplomacy alone is not sufficient. Geopolitical matters and political alignment alone are also not sufficient. I think that in today's environment, you need to ensure that whatever alliance that we have, it's underpinned by some business interest, which is why then I think that a BRICS free trade agreement is something that must be explored. And what is worrying at the moment is that the BRICS grouping keeps getting bigger. We have new members that are joining, Indonesia and many others in the African continent and elsewhere. And that is important because, of course, then it does seem like BRICS has this commanding power, at least in the world of geopolitics, because it is a bigger grouping. But let's face it, the grouping still runs by consensus, which means that if one of the members do not agree on anything, then everything stops. So the bigger the grouping, while we have not put together any concrete commercial aspect, then that becomes even much more difficult with as many members as we can. In fact, with the original BRICS members, we should have started then to ensure that when there was a creation of a BRICS bank, there's also some aspect that is related to trade, and of course then all of these political and geopolitical alignments that we are having. Because with the exception of that, over time, it may be tiring for many people, because I'm pretty sure that it's not just South Africans that are asking, what is the economic benefit of the BRICS? Some countries also will ask the same, and perhaps maybe even some of the new members that are coming in, they're coming in with the hope that there will be some commercial aspects that come out of this. But it doesn't seem like at the moment we are coming closer to that. And in fact, it's quite disappointing because we also have a BRICS Business Council. And the Business Council looks exactly on these things to say fostering trade, but also promoting investments. But to do all of these things, there has to be a framework, one that protects investments, two, that deals with opening up trade. And the issues of trade, they have to deal with really just two issues. One, lowering the tariffs that we all face amongst ourselves. And two, the aspect of the phytosanitary barriers. Because at the end of the day, while we talk a lot about the tariffs in the US, there are higher tariffs within the BRICS countries. I mean, if you are in South Africa and you are attempting to export wine to China, you still face tariffs that are between 14 and 20%. If you are trying to export macadamia, you're in South Africa, in Mpumalanga province, to China, you still face tariffs of around 12%. So in a way, these are as higher tariffs as what we see in the US, and in an environment like this, then the intra-BRICS trade is bound to be low. And we're facing this, and I'm speaking from a South Africa perspective, but it may as well be that other BRICS countries are also seeing the same. So I do think that, at least from a South African perspective, we have to ensure that we elevate the trade-related discussion within the BRICS countries. And as we do that as South Africa, we also need to deal with our own problems, because we still have some constraints into entering a number of free trade agreements. Because even if now, tomorrow, the BRICS countries can come up and say, hey, we are all coming together and we want a free trade agreement, let's get to the details, South Africa would still have some issues. And those issues would arise from the Southern African Customs Union, the SACU, because South Africa cannot negotiate a free trade agreement as a standalone country. We have to always look into the Southern African Customs Union. And who is there in that customs union? It is Namibia, it is Botswana, Eswatini, and ourselves. And we have to be negotiating then with them and ensure that their interests are aligned with South Africa. But that too is increasingly becoming very difficult to believe, because as South Africa is busy talking about export diversification, I don't believe that Botswana, Namibia, Eswatini, Lesotho have the same urgency as South Africa. And in fact, there are many instances where one have actually seen that some of these countries, they are actually slowing the pace at which South Africa should be negotiating with. So for South Africa to free itself and be able to go aggressively into opening as many export markets as we can, we have to untangle ourselves from SACU or reform SACU, not in a way that will be disastrous or uncaring, but I do think that South Africa needs to have a flexibility so that we can look after South Africa's interests, while at the same time, of course, caring about what the region believes. And I think that when we put the South African business interests first, we begin then to ensure that at least our economy grows and our businesses are able to access various markets that are interested in accessing. And of course, we would get to a point where even the Brics community can begin to be much more economically sound than it currently is. But at its current point, it does need South Africa a reform in SACU, but also a little bit of a push on trade matters within the Brics grouping. And with that, folks, I thought I had to put that forward because there are many of these questions that I typically see online. And I think although sometimes we don't answer people, the points and the concerns that they raise are actually important. And with the Brics free trade agreement, the agricultural sector would ultimately also benefit on that. And with that, folks, if you are listening to us for the first time, please make sure that you subscribe to our channel. We drop new episodes every Thursday. And of course, I wouldn't end this episode without thanking the folks that help us to ensure that we are able to record this. And that's the folks at Nedbank. Thanks for listening.